The first real shock of this war was not in Tehran. It was in Madrid, when Margarita Robles made clear that bases were not authorized and Spanish airspace was not authorized for actions tied to the Iran war. The second an ally can deny the sky to Washington in wartime, NATO stops looking like a steel wall and starts looking like a contract under stress. Then the Pentagon made it worse. Asked whether the United States still stood by NATO's collective defense, Pete Hegseth did not give a clean yes, and instead said that decision was for Donald Trump. Once that answer enters the bloodstream of the alliance, every capital hears the same message. Support is no longer assumed, and loyalty is now being priced. That is why Trump's NATO threat suddenly sounded different. When he said a U.S. departure was beyond reconsideration, it no longer felt like old campaign theater, or another tantrum about burden sharing. It felt like retaliation after allies refused to help carry a war they did not approve and did not want attached to their territory. If you want the part of the story hidden behind the explosions, subscribe now, and in the comments, tell me the one word that fits this moment best. Fracture, leverage, or betrayal, because that answer tells you whether NATO is still an alliance or already in negotiation. This is the layer most people feel before they can even explain it. They know they are not just watching a war spread through the Middle East. They're watching a war expose what Western unity was really made of when the pressure stops being theoretical and starts asking for runways, airspace, legal cover, and obedience. That is why this title hits so hard. NATO's backbone was never just tanks, speeches, and summit photos. It was trust that when Washington moved, Allied territory would still function as part of a common strategic system. And trust that when Europe needed America, the treaty would still mean something more than a transaction. Spain was not the only break in the line. France reportedly refused overflight for a resupply flight carrying American weapons to Israel for use in the war, and Italy denied permission for U.S. military aircraft to land at Sigonella Air Base before heading east. That is not symbolic dissent. That is allied resistance entering the bloodstream of military logistics. And once dissent reaches logistics, the argument changes completely. This is no longer about whether European leaders are making stern statements for domestic audiences. It becomes a question of whether Washington can still assume that alliance. Geography belongs to a shared war effort the moment it decides that effort is necessary. That is the first hidden brutality of this story. America is learning, in public, that some allies still want the shield but no longer grant the launch pad automatically. Europe is learning, in public, that Washington may now treat refusal not as disagreement, but as proof that the alliance itself is failing. Marco Rubio said it with almost no disguise. He argued that if NATO means the United States defends Europe when Europe is attacked, but Europe denies basing rights when America says it needs them, then it is not a very good arrangement and must be re-examined. That is, Washington openly redefining alliance value in terms of wartime usability. And the second that sentence is spoken aloud, the whole frame changes. NATO stops sounding like a solemn mutual defense compact and starts sounding like a system of conditional services, protection in exchange for access, deterrence in exchange for compliance, American security guarantees in exchange for European strategic permission. That is exactly why the viewer clicks this title. The audience is not coming for a civics lesson. They are coming because they can sense that beneath the Iran war sits a darker question. Is NATO still a pact among allies? Or is it becoming a structure where America expects its partners to function as infrastructure when the emergency is named in Washington? The most unsettling part is that both sides can make a case. Washington can say it carries the weight, stations the forces, underwrites the deterrence, and therefore cannot accept Allied hesitation when it says the threat is real. Europe can say collective defense was never supposed to become a blank check for wars launched without real consultation and loaded onto Allied soil after the fact. France's response exposed that split perfectly. Emmanuel Macron sent the aircraft carrier Charles de Gaulle and its escort toward the Mediterranean, and reinforced French assets in the region, even while Paris took a more legally critical line, and refused automatic alignment with Washington's operational needs. France was not choosing passivity. France was drawing a line between protecting its own interests and enabling someone else's war logic. That is a distinction too many people miss. Europe is not refusing risk. Europe is refusing automatic incorporation. It is willing to harden its posture, move forces, secure assets, and protect nationals. But it does not want that posture mistaken for a silent signature under an open-ended escalation cycle. And that matters for attention, because the stakes keep getting worse the deeper you go. The longer this war runs, the less it looks like a temporary quarrel over tactics and the more it looks like a fight over the meaning of alliance itself. Does membership mean mutual defense against attack, or does it also mean that your airspace, bases, and political consent can be requisitioned whenever Washington decides the moment is strategic enough? That is why Britain, France, and Germany chose their words so carefully. They said they did not take part in the strikes on Iran, even while staying in contact with Washington, Israel, and regional partners and pushing for negotiations to resume. Those are not the words of allies snapping cleanly away. They are the words of allies trying to stay inside the tent without becoming responsible for what is being done from it. That balancing act is not weakness. It is fear mixed with calculation. European governments see legal danger, domestic blowback, shipping risk, energy pain, and the permanent hazard of being tied to an escalation sequence they did not choose and may not be able to stop once they are visibly part of it. And over all of that hangs the larger strategic nightmare. Europe still depends on American power where Russia is concerned. So leaders in Europe are trying to achieve something almost impossible: resist entrapment without provoking abandonment, preserve sovereignty without detonating the alliance, and keep the US close without letting every US emergency become a European obligation by default. NATO's official center has tried to hold that contradiction together. Mark Rutte described Iran as an exporter of chaos and warned that the danger it poses is far-reaching, while still keeping the alliance focused on defending NATO territory, rather than turning the Iran war into a formal NATO mission. That gap is deliberate. The alliance is acknowledging the threat, while refusing to own the campaign. But gray zones are where alliances begin to rot from the inside. A gray zone lets every government claim it is being responsible, while quietly acting first, as a sovereign trying to avoid being dragged deeper. It keeps the flags in place while slowing the instinct that made the system feel automatic. That slowing instinct is the second major payoff of the title. NATO's backbone is on the table because the muscles still exist, but the reflexes no longer look guaranteed. That is much more dangerous than a public screaming match, because it means the alliance can remain formally intact, while becoming strategically uncertain where it matters most. The war has already brushed that nerve hard enough to prove it. Incidents involving Turkey and a British base on Cyprus raised immediate questions about how close the conflict could come to alliance territory. Yet the threshold for a collective NATO response remained high, and even attribution in some cases stayed contested. So the alliance can feel the heat of the war without producing the clarity of shared action. That should worry anyone who thinks deterrence is only about force. Deterrence also depends on coherence. If danger near Allied territory still produces hedging, threshold management, and argument over what counts, then every adversary watching learns the same lesson. NATO can be pressured near its edge, without necessarily moving as one political body. And Washington learns something ugly too. It learns that even when Allied interests are brushed by the war, European leaders may still answer first with legal caution, domestic calculation, and calibrated distance. That is not the automatic alignment American policymakers think alliance dependency should buy. This is where the information war runs inside the strategic war. The US story is that Europe wants American protection, American troops, and American deterrence, but refuses to stand up when America asks for something in return. The European story is that alliance membership never meant surrendering sovereignty, for conflicts launched without consensus and then backfilled with demands for access. Both sides gain something from their version. Washington gains leverage by turning refusal into ingratitude. Europe gains cover by turning refusal into legality and restraint. But beneath both narratives sits the same hard fact. The old assumption of automatic Allied cooperation has been broken in the open. Europe's answer to that break has been cautious distance. The continent is trying to avoid direct involvement while focusing on the priorities it believes matter most to itself. Which means the war with Iran is being treated less as a shared Western mission than as a dangerous external shock that must be managed without full ownership. That is already a form of strategic distancing from Washington, and once allies begin distancing in practice, even if not in ceremony, the blast radius goes beyond this war. Future requests for overflight, future basing negotiations, future emergency deployments, future coalition asks, all of them now happen in the shadow of this precedent. The question will always linger: is this collective defense, or another test of whether Europe will be made to carry a war. It never signed. That is why the title's second half lands so hard. The Iran war is turning allies against Washington, not because Europe has gone anti-American overnight, and not because leaders in Europe suddenly sympathize with Tehran. It is happening because the war has forced European governments to weigh a new fear. That following Washington too far may now be riskier than resisting it. Once that fear enters the alliance, everything changes. The threat is no longer only outside the system, it is inside the calculations of the members themselves. An ally begins asking not just how to deter the enemy, but how to avoid becoming the next piece of someone else's escalation architecture. The clearest clue to where Europe wants this to go came in the language around the Strait of Hormuz. Britain, France, Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, Japan, and others signaled readiness to contribute to safe passage through the strait, which means they are more willing to manage the consequences of the war than to bless the opening logic of the war itself. They will help contain the fire, but they do not want to own the hand that lit it. That is a subtle position, but it is not a weak one. It says Europe will help protect global commerce, maritime security, and economic stability, yet still resist being folded, without limit, into the strategic meaning Washington assigns to the conflict. In plain language, Europe is trying to police the fallout without surrendering the right to say the war should never have been loaded onto the alliance this way. And that is where the story rehooks one last time. Because if Europe is now willing to help with the aftermath, while resisting the mission logic, then this is no longer just a disagreement over burden sharing. It is a disagreement over legitimacy. Who gets to define the threat? Who gets to define the emergency? And who gets to decide when alliance assets become morally and politically obligated? So let's answer the central question directly. If Trump is bluffing, the damage is still severe, because the bluff itself tells Europe that Washington may now measure loyalty by wartime compliance far beyond the old core of treaty defense. European capitals will not forget that lesson, even if the language softens later. If Trump is not bluffing, then the damage is deeper still. Because that would mean the Iran war has exposed the foundational contradiction at the heart of the alliance. Europe wants American protection against existential threats, but Washington increasingly expects that protection to purchase strategic obedience in return. No elegant press release can hide that once it has been spoken aloud. Either way, the deeper conclusion survives. The Iran war did not just reveal policy differences. It revealed that NATO's backbone is not a permanent fact of nature. It is a political agreement built on reciprocity, access, and trust, and this war has put all three on the table at the same time. That is why the image from Madrid matters so much. Not because one denied route wins or loses a war by itself, but because it proved an ally can still say no and make that no matter once refusal becomes real. Solidarity is no longer an assumption, it becomes bargaining, and that may be the one conclusion viewers cannot shake after this ends. The alliance may survive on paper, keep the same headquarters, fly the same flags, and hold the same summits, but once the sky itself becomes negotiable, everyone inside the system starts hearing the treaty differently. Stay with this channel, because we follow the moment the headline ends and the real fracture begins.